Every afternoon, as the cold autumn wind swept through the quiet suburbs of Bristol, Evelyn stood by the window of her living room, staring out at the small, weathered stone outhouse at the edge of the courtyard. For months, that isolated structure had been a source of unexplainable dread and mystery. Inside the main house, the rhythmic, heavy ticking of the grandfather clock was the only sound that broke the suffocating silence. On the bed lay her husband, Richard, a man 15 years her senior, once a formidable, high-ranking government official whose fierce demeanor had dominated her existence. Now he was a silent shadow of his former self, paralyzed by a sudden stroke that had stripped him of his speech and mobility. Whenever Evelyn approached his bedside to tend to him, Richard's eyes would fill with a desperate, frantic panic. Tears would stream down his hollow cheeks, and with immense struggle, he would raise two trembling fingers, pointing directly through the window toward the old stone outhouse. "What is it, Richard? What are you trying to tell me?" Evelyn would whisper, her heart racing. He would only blink tearfully, his gaze locked onto that distant door. Driven by curiosity, Evelyn had gone into the outhouse multiple times. She searched through the dusty shelves, shifted old cardboard boxes, and swept the cobwebs, but she found absolutely nothing. It was just a neglected, empty storage room. Weeks turned into months, and Richard's condition only deteriorated. The mystery remained locked inside his mind until one rainy evening when his fragile heart finally stopped beating. Richard passed away, leaving Evelyn alone in a vast, quiet house, haunted by the memory of his final, silent weeping and that persistent, trembling finger pointing toward the dark outhouse. A week had passed since Richard's funeral. The black mourning dress felt heavy on Evelyn's shoulders as she sat on the porch watching the dark clouds gather over the English countryside. She was only in her late 20s, possessing a striking, delicate beauty that had once filled her youth with hope. Yet, looking back, her marriage felt like a beautifully wrapped box filled with nothing but cold ash. Growing up in a modest countryside town, her parents were blinded by Richard's prestigious government status and wealthy background. They ignored the 15-year age gap, his stern nature, and his balding visage, believing they were securing a golden future for their daughter. But reality had shattered her expectations within the first month of their marriage. Evelyn vividly remembered a sunny afternoon during their honeymoon in Paris. They were walking through a bustling boulevard when Richard noticed the polite glances she received from strangers. Later that evening in their hotel, his insecurity flared up like wildfire. "You look too frail, too childlike," Richard had remarked coldly, tossing a box of heavy pastries onto the table. "Eat more, gain weight. I won't have people looking at us and assuming you are my daughter. You need to look like a mature woman who belongs to a man of my stature." Evelyn had chuckled softly, assuming it was a joke. "Perhaps you could join a gymnasium, Richard. Keep up with your own fitness instead of making me change." The words had barely left her lips when Richard's hand struck her face with brutal force. The impact sent her crashing onto the carpet, her cheek burning with sudden pain. "Know your place, woman," Richard had roared, towering over her with eyes full of malice. "Do not dare to mock me under my roof. I provide for you, I clothe you, and I own this life you lead." If a woman isn't kept under a tight leash, she forgets who rules the house. From that day onward, the emotional and physical abuse became a daily routine. Richard constantly brought home heavy, greasy fast food and rich sweets, forcing her to consume them until her vibrant health faded, her weight ballooned, and she felt too ashamed to look into a mirror or face her family. He isolated her, stripped her of her confidence, and eventually stopped giving her a single penny, demanding she find a job to pay for her own basic needs. Determined to survive and reclaim her shattered dignity, Evelyn used her university degree to secure a position as a literature teacher at a prestigious local college. The job became her sanctuary. Surrounded by bright, hopeful students, she could briefly forget the living nightmare waiting for her at home. Sometimes the emotional weight was too much to bear. A close colleague would find her weeping silently in the staff room, shocked to hear about the cruelty hiding behind Richard's respected public persona. To the world, Richard was an honorable statesman. At home, he was a tyrant who believed a wife's spirit must be broken through intimidation. Their lack of children only deepened her isolation, forcing her to wear a fake smile whenever neighbors asked about their seemingly perfect life. Then came the fateful night that changed everything. It started over a trivial matter. Richard had returned home in a foul mood, screaming because she had prepared a simple meal of broth and bread instead of a lavish roast dinner. "If you want expensive meat, you need to provide the household allowance, Richard," Evelyn had shouted back, her patience finally snapping. "My teaching salary hasn't been credited, and I have nothing left." Infuriated by her defiance, Richard began pacing the room, his face turning an alarming shade of crimson as he hurled vicious insults. But mid-sentence, his voice caught, his eyes widened in sheer terror, his limbs grew violently stiff, and he collapsed heavily onto the dining table, knocking over the porcelain plates. Realizing it was a medical emergency, Evelyn frantically called for a taxi and rushed him to the city hospital through the dead of night. After agonizing hours of waiting, the chief neurologist stepped out of the emergency ward, his expression grim. "I am sorry, Mrs. Evelyn," the doctor said softly. The severe emotional distress pushed his blood pressure to a critical level, triggering a massive hemorrhagic stroke. The damage to his brainstem is extensive. He has survived, but he is completely paralyzed. He will never walk or speak again. Bringing Richard back home felt like moving a ghost into the house. Evelyn took care of him diligently, turning him every few hours, feeding him spoonfuls of liquid food, and keeping him clean. Despite the years of torment he had inflicted upon her, she could not abandon her humanity. As the medical bills began to drain her modest savings, the dynamics in the house shifted. Richard lay powerless, his angry mind trapped inside an immobile body. Evelyn noticed a profound change in his eyes. The arrogance was replaced with a deep, hollow despair. He realized that the woman he had abused was now his only lifeline. His wealthy relatives, who once hovered around him for political favors and expensive gifts, completely vanished the moment his salary stopped and his influence dried up. It was during these quiet evening hours that Richard would stare at the outhouse, weeping silently and pointing his rigid fingers. After his passing, Evelyn gave him a respectable funeral, attended by a mere handful of people. With Richard gone, the house felt strangely empty. Her longtime housekeeper, Martha, had taken a brief leave to visit her family in the countryside, leaving Evelyn entirely alone with her thoughts and the mounting piles of chores. On a quiet Sunday morning, having finished her grading and household work early, Evelyn's eyes fell upon the outhouse once again. The sun was shining warmly, dispelling the usual gloom of the courtyard. "Today," Evelyn murmured to herself, tying her hair back, "I will finally clear that room out for good." The heavy wooden door of the outhouse creaked loudly as Evelyn pushed it open. The air inside was thick with dust and the scent of old timber. She began moving the rusted garden tools and stacking the old wooden crates into a corner. While dragging a heavy, water-damaged chest away from the back wall, her foot caught on an uneven floorboard. She lost her balance, stumbling violently backward. Her shoulder smashed hard into a large plywood partition that formed the back lining of the room. With a loud, splintering crash, the old wood gave way, and Evelyn tumbled backward through the broken frame, landing heavily on the dusty ground of a hidden, dark chamber. Whipping the dust from her eyes, she stood up and turned on her flashlight. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. Behind the false plywood wall was a concealed, windowless room, untouched by time. In the center stood a massive, heavy iron safe. Heart pounding against her ribs, Evelyn approached it. To her surprise, the key was hanging from a small hook hidden just beneath the safe's rim, undoubtedly placed there by Richard in case of emergencies. With a trembling hand, she inserted the key and turned the heavy dial. The iron doors swung open with a dull metallic groan. Inside were neat, towering stacks of British banknotes, velvet pouches filled with solid gold coins, rare antique jewelry, and a set of legal property documents. Evelyn picked up the papers with a shaking hand. They were the deeds to the very house she stood in, completely paid for and registered legally under her own name. Sitting amidst the immense wealth, the truth suddenly washed over Evelyn like a tidal wave. Richard had been a deeply corrupt official, hoarding hundreds of thousands of bribes and illegal kickbacks over his long career. He had hidden his illicit fortune here, terrified of government audits. That was why he had pointed frantically toward the outhouse on his deathbed. He wasn't trying to scare her. In his final days of guilt and helplessness, he was trying to reveal the hidden fortune, knowing it was the only way to secure her future and make amends for his cruelty. Evelyn acted swiftly. Over the next 48 hours, she cleared out the hidden room, deposited the funds securely into a private account, and immediately put the isolated estate up for sale. She wanted nothing to do with the house that held so many dark memories.
Within a week, as she was packing her personal suitcases, a loud, aggressive knocking echoed through the front gates. Evelyn walked out to find a flamboyantly dressed woman standing in the driveway, flanked by 2 young children. "Can I help you?" Evelyn asked, guarding the door. The woman smirked, adjusting her expensive sunglasses. "My name is Beatrice. I am Richard's real wife. We wed in secret 5 years ago in London, and I am here with his children to claim our rightful share of his estate." Evelyn felt a sharp pang of disgust, remembering how Richard's cousin had warned her about rumors of his infidelity. "Richard passed away a week ago, Beatrice, and he left no official will regarding any secondary family." "I don't care," Beatrice hissed, stepping forward aggressively. "I know he hoarded millions from his government contracts. I will tear this house apart until I find what belongs to my children." Before Evelyn could stop her, Beatrice stormed into the living room, tossing drawers and throwing vases to the floor in a frantic search for money. Finding nothing but empty cupboards, she turned on Evelyn with a bitter glare. "You think you're clever hiding his wealth. The law will catch up to you." She grabbed her children and stormed out, swearing vengeance. Later that evening, Martha, the housekeeper, returned from her leave. Seeing the mess, she sighed deeply and took Evelyn's hands. "Don't listen to that wicked woman, madam," Martha whispered gently. Everyone in the local district knows Beatrice. She is a professional con artist who targets wealthy older men. Those children aren't even Richard's. Their biological father took them back just this morning. She was merely trying to intimidate you for money." Relieved and resolute, Evelyn finalized the sale of the estate. She distributed a substantial portion of the wealth to establish a beautiful, fully funded orphanage in the city, dedicating it to charity so that Richard's tainted money could finally serve a noble, pure purpose. With her remaining clean funds, she relocated to the picturesque city of Bath, purchasing a charming townhouse and a modest car. She secured a teaching position at a historic local college, eager to build a life defined entirely by her own choices. Yet, as the initial excitement of her new life settled, a familiar enemy crept into her grand townhouse: absolute, deafening loneliness. The days at the college passed quickly, but the evenings were long and hollow. Her parents refused to leave their rural village, constantly sending letters urging her to remarry. "You are still young, Evelyn. Life is too long to be walked alone. Find a companion of your own choice this time," they wrote. But her heart remained guarded, terrified of trusting another man. At the college, Evelyn frequently worked alongside Mr. Julian Sterling, a quiet, brilliant professor of European history. Julian was a gentleman of remarkable intellect and profound kindness, though a veil of deep, unspoken sorrow always seemed to hang over him. His father, Mr. Arthur Sterling, was the venerable principal and director of the institution. One rainy evening, Evelyn volunteered to deliver a stack of urgent examination files to the principal's grand estate on the outskirts of the city. As she stepped into the warm, dimly lit study, she noticed Mr. Arthur Sterling sitting by a roaring fireplace. On the mantelpiece above stood a large silver-framed portrait of a beautiful woman, adorned with a fresh garland of white roses.
Mr. Sterling welcomed her warmly, instructing his butler to bring fresh coffee. Noting her gaze on the portrait, the old man smiled wistfully. "That is Julian's mother," Mr. Sterling said softly, his voice tinged with decades of longing. "She passed away the very night Julian was born. I raised him alone in this vast house. He grew up carrying a terrible silent guilt, believing his birth was the cause of his mother's demise." Evelyn listened intently, her heart aching for Julian. "He is an exceptionally reserved man, Mr. Sterling. I once tried to ask him about his past, but he politely requested that we keep our relationship strictly professional." "Yes," the old principal sighed, staring into the flames. "5 years ago, he finally opened his heart to a young woman. Their wedding was finalized, but the day before the ceremony, her car skidded off a rain-slicked cliff near the coast. She didn't survive. Since that tragedy, Julian considers himself a curse. He swore an oath never to marry, believing anyone he loves is doomed to suffer." Mr. Sterling turned his wise eyes toward Evelyn. "I know about your past, my dear. I know the hardships you endured with your late husband. Loneliness is a slow, agonizing poison. I have lived with it for 35 years. I do not wish to see my son or a wonderful woman like you waste away in empty houses. Julian respects you immensely. He speaks of your strength and grace every time he sits at this table." Unbeknownst to them, Julian had entered the hallway, returning from his evening walk. Standing in the shadows of the doorway, he had heard his father's emotional plea. Evelyn returned home that night, her mind in a whirlwind. For the next 3 days, she remained absent from the college, taking a brief leave to confront the storm raging inside her heart. She realized that not all men were like Richard.
Some carried wounds just as deep as hers. On the fourth morning, a gentle knock sounded on her townhouse door. She opened it to find Mr. Arthur Sterling standing on her porch, accompanied by Julian. Julian's eyes, usually guarded, were now filled with a vulnerable, sincere warmth. "Evelyn," Julian said, his voice steady yet soft, stepping forward. "Our pasts are broken, and our hearts bear heavy scars. But perhaps together we can build a sanctuary where the shadows can no longer reach us. Will you walk this path with me?" Looking at Julian, Evelyn felt the last remnants of her fear melt away. She smiled through her tears and nodded. A month later, a quiet, intimate wedding was held in the college chapel, attended only by close friends and a beaming Mr. Sterling. As Evelyn stood beside Julian, watching the golden sunset paint the horizon, she realized that life, with all its cruel twists and hidden rooms, had finally led her to a destination of true peace, dignity, and unconditional love. The end.